Hello world, welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about sky spheres, and we're also going to be going over equirectangular projections, which is a crazy word, but it's not as crazy as you think. It's just basically how we are going to create the sky spheres. You've all been really great throughout the entire lifespan of this entire channel, and I really appreciate everything you've done for it. I just hit 1,000 subscribers, which is, pretty dope. It's compared to big time people. It's not crazy, but I appreciate everything you guys have done. So without further ado, let's get into skyboxes. Sky spheres. We're going to do sky spheres, not skyboxes. Let's do sky spheres. Okay, so before we get started, I know you probably know a little bit about skyboxes or sky spheres. Perhaps you're a professional. I have no idea, but this is going to be my take. So basically, you have sky spheres and sky boxes. The difference should be obvious. One uses spheres and one uses a box. Pretty simple. But this is 3 images that represent that sort of thing being implemented. The top left is Halo, the famous Halo ring. In the background, they didn't create an entire ring planet. They basically just took a texture of a 360-degree view and slapped it in the game. But the models, the 3D models of the trees and the terrain, those are real 3D models, but they didn't build an entire planet for this game. They just popped a texture in the sky, and it just looks like this. It gives the illusion that there is a big giant halo ring, but there is not. In the zombie one, you'll see the same thing. We have these 3-dimensional models, these rocks and these zombies right in front of your face, but in the deep background, it's just going to use a skybox or a sky sphere. Now, what you can do is you can use your sky sphere to create really cool post-processing effects, because each bright spot on that sky sphere could technically be a light source. I'm not going to get into HDRI right now, but that is a really cool implementation in this zombie game. And then the bottom one is Smite. If you look at it, you see the northern lights. Those are not a part of the background. Those are probably 3D assets, but in the background, you definitely see stars. And I'm betting my bottom dollar that those stars are not an entire planetary system, all right? It's not a universe out there that is a simple skybox or sky sphere. Now, I hope I don't lose that bet. Let's move on. We are doing sky spheres, and in order to wrap an image around sky spheres, you need one thing. That is an equirectangular projection. Now, if you were to look at the map of the Earth, obviously the Earth isn't a 2D texture. It's a projection onto a sphere, onto a 3-dimensional sphere. Another really good example would be something like these clouds. These clouds kind of twist and mold around in circles, but really it's just flat clouds, and they go in a 360 view. So that's something important. It's all 360. Let's explain a little bit more about the equirectangular projection. So the top is obviously going to be the top dome. The bottom is going to be the bottom dome. And you can kind of notice how the right and the left side would wrap around a sphere by that big M on the top and the W on the bottom. And so that's basically how the projection's made up. Here's just another example where maybe you want some clouds on the top, but you don't care about what goes on the bottom. So what you do is you wrap it with this 360 view of clouds, and you would get clouds and a sun. Freaking cool, right? So all we really need to create this is we need our equirectangular projection, we need a mesh, and then we can combine the two. But this is what it would look like if we were to go inside of that sphere. Ah, yes. We're inside, and now we can look around, and it looks like there's clouds up in the sky. Add your entire world in there, and bam, you got a video game. Easy peasy. So, yeah, let's jump into sky spheres. Okay, to get started with sky spheres, what we're going to need to do first is we're going to need to import a mesh, a spherical mesh that doesn't contain any material. It's just basically UV coordinates and vertices. That's all it is. And then we're also going to need to import our actual sky sphere equirectangular projection. Now, I have those over here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So what I'll do is I'll go to Core, Res, and then I'm going to go down here to, well, I guess Sphere's already open. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to create an entirely new folder, new group, and I'm going to call it Sky Sphere. And then I'm going to keep with the lowercase. So Sky Sphere, and inside there I'm going to drag my 2 things that I need. So we have clouds.png, and that's just going to be this basic default picture where we have the gray bottom and the nice clouds up top. And then we have the sky sphere, which is actually just a low-res representation of our sphere, and it doesn't actually have an MTL class or file associated with it. It's just a plain old sphere. So now that we have those, we need to go down into our entity libraries and add them. So we're going to go to Entities, libraries. Let's start with the mesh. So for the mesh, we scroll up to the top here. I'm just going to create a comment that's called Sky Spheres. I don't really even need to do that because we know there's only going to be one sky sphere. So I'll do sky sphere here. Move that new line and let's import it. So I'm going to copy the quad, go here. What is our sky sphere called? Well, it's called skysphere.obj, so sky sphere. And then we're going to use our sky sphere type. Okay, cool. We have the mesh in our game engine. Easy. Now let's add the texture. Texture library. Let's go up to the top here. In this case, I will put sky sphere because technically we can change this whenever we want. And I'm going to put case and I'll put clouds sky sphere. So library.update value. Let's go ahead and copy that. Go down here and just do sky sphere. It's a PNG, so that's by default this texture. But we will need to add an origin of the bottom left because I just know that because I've done this before. So go ahead and copy this, paste it here. And we now have both our mesh and our texture inside of the engine. So now what we can do is we can close this res folder and move on to bigger and better things. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to go into our game shiz and we're going to go down to game objects and we're going to add a sky sphere game object. So let's create a new file and create a new Swift file that we can add into our game. So let's call this sky sphere. I'm going to drag it up a little bit just because I want it a little higher. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to say import metal kit. And then we're going to say class sky sphere. Game object. Oh, not game time. Game object. We will say init. And the only thing we're going to pass in is the sky sphere texture type. Because, yeah, that's how we're going to be controlling the texture that appears up in the sky. And then that's going to be of type texture types. And that's it. We will then call super.init with sky sphere as the name and the mesh type. Well, we have our sky sphere mesh type. Okay, moving on. As you can see, we have the sky sphere texture type that we're not using yet. Let's go ahead and set a private variable just because I'm going to use it later called private var sky underscore sky sphere texture type. I'm just going to copy it because I can't type. Man, and that will be a texture types right there, and then I'm just gonna set that sky sphere texture type equals sky sphere texture type, and then we will use the texture, use the base color texture of our sky sphere texture type. Okay, so now we have just like a generic sky sphere object that we can add to the game that uses whatever we want. So let's go to our forest scene, and right after we add our light, let's add our sky sphere. Right here, we will say let sky sphere, man, I keep doing that, equal sky sphere. Pass in whatever type we want. In our case, it's the cloud sky sphere. I will add child, and that will be of sky sphere. I'm going to press play and see what it looks like. So I got an error, and of course, it's because I named it sky sphere when I should have called this clouds. It's clouds.png, not skysphere.png. So I'm going to press play, and now we're going to check it out. Okay, so we get this big black blob. It obviously doesn't look like anything, but there is a sphere in the scene. Okay, but the problem is this is a custom sphere, which doesn't have any material values associated with it, and there's probably a little bug in our system somewhere. But to fix it, it should be a pretty slick, quick fix. We're going to go to our sky sphere. I'm just going to basically say var material equals material. I will say material dot is lit equals false. Material dot use base texture equals true. And then I'm just going to say use this material. That should do the trick. And voila! In the center of our scene, we have a sky sphere. Okay, no, it's not really a sky sphere because it's just a sphere that has a sky on it. But if I were to go inside it, look, I can look around and, you know, it's just a giant sky. It's so beautiful. Now to fix this, the next fix would be to set the scale. Right now it's too small. Let's scale it up. Let's say set scale to something like, I don't know, 10. Scale it up 10 times and see what that looks like. What? Look at that! We're already almost there. As you can see, there's a sky sphere, a sphere in the sky, and it looks like one continuous three-dimensional image. Now, if I were to back up, though, so I'm going to back up, you'll see that we can actually go outside of that sphere, because all he did was scale it up. So what we really need to do is anytime the player moves in space, we need the sphere to move with him. So he'll be in the center of the sphere for the rest of his life. And in order to do that, we're going to need to do a couple of things. Okay, it's not going to be just a straightforward make the sphere move with him. We actually need to create 2 new shaders. And the reason we're creating 2 new shaders is because we kind of probably want to modify them in the future, but I do also want to just go through the process of creating another shader because, you know, it's kind of fun. So what I'll do is I'll go into graphics, I'm going to go into shaders, and I'm going to create a new file here. It will be a metal file right there. And I will call it, let's call it Sky Sphere Shaders. Just like that, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to code out some stuff, and then I'll talk to you about what I coded out after that. So I'll speed through this part, and then we'll talk about what I did. Okay, so let's talk about what the heck I just did. Well, the first thing I did was I went over to basic shaders and just copied all this because it's pretty similar. It's just now we're not doing any lighting. We don't light the actual light source. That doesn't make any sense. So these are going to be our sky sphere vertex shader and our sky sphere fragment shader. All of this is the same exact stuff from the basic shaders. We're going to change it up just a little bit in just a second, but for now, this is the current setup. And then we have our sky sphere fragment shader, which is, of course, basically the majority of the things from the basic shader. We're just not doing lighting anymore. We're just sampling from texture 0, which is just where we're sending our base textures. We're going to update that in a second, but let's just move forward, make sure that builds. Everything's going to succeed. Let's jump into actually, putting these 2 new binary shaders into our engine. So let's jump up to libraries here. Let's go to shader library. I'm going to create 2 here. I will say case sky sphere vertex shader, and we will say case sky sphere fragment, and then just basically copy these right here, paste, and I'll paste it right here too. So we will say sky sphere vertex, and then we want the sky sphere fragment with sky sphere. Okay, so now these 2 shaders will be these 2 shaders will now be built into our engine, so we can use them inside of a new render pipeline state. So we're going to need to create a new render pipeline state. I will call it case sky sphere. We will need to add it to our library. So let's scroll down, copy class basic render pipeline state, and replace 2 values, well, a couple of values actually. Sky sphere here, render pipeline state. Right here, we're going to need to say sky sphere, and we will say sky sphere vertex, sky sphere vertex, sky. Oh man, apparently I don't know what I'm doing. So now we have this sky sphere render pipeline state, pretty similar to the basic render pipeline descriptor, but we're going to add it right here, where we will say sky sphere render pipeline state. And we will say that for sky sphere. Cool. So now we have basically the same render pipeline state, except we're not doing lighting. I think that's the only difference right now. We're going to add some differences in the future, but for now, it's relatively straightforward. Let's jump back to our game objects and go into our sky sphere and use it. Well, as of right now, we can't actually use it. There's no way for us to use it because we can't change the render pipeline state type yet. But what we can do is we can go to the parent object, which is game object, and inside of game object, which is right here if you're curious, we can instead at the very top create a var render pipeline state type, and that will be of render pipeline state types. I will return .basic, and this will be the default generic render pipeline state type that we use. So I can copy that, and instead down here inside of do render, we're using .basic. Instead, let's use that type. So what I can do is I can override this in the children classes. So inside SkySphere at the very top, let's go render pipeline state type and return our new SkySphere. Which means we don't necessarily need to pass in materials anymore, so don't need the material. And everything else looks fine. So let's go ahead and press play, and hopefully everything's still in place with our new render pipeline state. And of course, I probably messed up something because it broke. Let's go into our shader library and look at what I've done. Okay, we have SkySphere vertex. This should say fret. Let's try that again. And voila, we are still in our sphere. But as you can see, if we back up, we're still moving. We're not moving with the SkySphere. We're moving, it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's stop that and add a simple change into our vertex shader that's gonna make that work 100%. So let's go ahead and go into share.metal. We're gonna start there. And basically, this has to do with the view matrix. So when the camera moves back, everything else moves in the opposite direction. So we need to just remove the translation from the SkySphere. And we can do that because in the 4x4 matrix of the translation is in the fourth column. So there's X, Y, Z in the fourth column. So all we have to do is we need to remove that. And to remove that, we're gonna pass not just a view matrix, but we're also gonna pass a float 4x4 sky view matrix. Yeah, that's what we'll call it. We're gonna go to core, and we need to add that to types as well. So let's go to scene constants, var sky view matrix equals matrix identity float 4x4. I love copying things so much faster, and I suck at typing. Cool, sky view matrix, and now we can just set that. Let's go ahead and set that inside of our scenes. So where we're setting the view matrix is inside of scene.swift. If we were to scroll down here, you'll see we're setting the view matrix. So underneath that, we can say scene constants dot sky view matrix equals, well, let's start with the default scene constants dot view matrix. So we want that same scene, we want it to rotate and all that jazz. We just don't want it to we want it to stay with the player. We don't want it to move in the opposite direction of the player. So all we need to do is we need to remove those values in that row column of the matrix. So we say sky view matrix at column, well, it's from 0 to 3. So the last column is going to be 3, index 0. That's going to be our x equals 0. And I'll put that. Remove x translation. And then we're going to do the same thing right here and right here. But this will be the Y translation. This will be the Z translation. And it's the second, or the second and the third. But 0, 1, 2, we're going to remove those translations. Now, if we were to press play, everything should work just fine. We should now just have a fully implemented SkySphere. And boom, look up in the sky. You see these beautiful clouds. If I were to try to move, the SkySphere moves with me. Why is that? Well, we didn't actually implement that inside of our shader. So go to SkySphere shaders, and instead of saying scene constants.view matrix, we need to say dot sky view matrix. So right off the bat, it actually doesn't look like it's working, but it is. If we were to kind of go back a little bit, you'll see that everything's inside there. But look, now this sphere is moving with us. No matter where we go, it's always moving with us. Always. So now we're entirely in the sphere. We can't go out of the sphere. All we really need to do is just make it bigger, because right now it's just too small, I think. So let's go to the SkySphere. We'll set the scale to, I don't know, 1,000. 1,000 works. You can set it to whatever scale you want. Technically, if your projection matrix uses a far of less than 1,000, it'll probably disappear. So I suggest setting this to something within your far. Because it'll break if not. So set scale 1,000. That'll look just fine. Now we want to do one more thing. Now later down in the future, I do want to do some like better lighting tutorials, like more realistic lighting. And in order to do that, we will need like HDRIs. Basically, we're going to need to sample from the skybox or the SkySphere. So what I want to do is I want to implement that now so that we kind of just have it set up. And it's not that hard. Basically, all we need to do is we need to override render. So inside the SkySphere class, override render, call super.render, render command encoder. Make sure you do this or else it'll break. Everything will break. Make sure you call super.render is what I mean. So it renders all of its children classes. And then we just need to say render command encoder dot set fragment texture. Now what texture? It's just basically entities dot textures at our sky sphere. And this is why I wanted to make it a private variable at index 10. I'm going to use index 10 for our sky sphere or our skybox or whatever our environmental wrapper is. So 10 will be where we set it. Now that means we don't need to use base color texture because that sets it at 0. We don't want to do that. So we're setting this to 10. The only other thing we need to do to have this all set up is we need to go into our sky sphere shaders, and now instead of texture at index 0, we need to do texture at index 10. And if I press play, we should have a sky sphere fully functional. Looks awesome. You can go ahead and modify this fragment shader to contain any sort of code you want to make, maybe like make the horizon red or something. But yeah, so now we have a sky sphere and it looks pretty freaking epic. One thing we have is we have rd.total game time equals, we have our scene constants dot total game time, I think. Yeah, so now we can access RD and we can say maybe, I don't know, color.r or color times equals, let's say the cosine of rd.total game time. I want to see what that looks like. So now our environment should light up different colors on and off, or at least it'll go gray and then not gray. I don't know. We're going to see what happens. I have no idea what this does. Ooh, it gets darker. Oh, nighttime, and then it should come back on at some point. Ooh, that's actually kind of scary. Add some stars up there. Ooh, there it is. Okay, so now you know how to implement a freaking sky sphere. I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. Skyboxes is an entirely different process that involves 6 separate images, or maybe one image that looks a little funky that we're going to need to, capture different squares. Sky sphere is a little bit more straightforward. I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode. If you did, hit thumbs up and or subscribe, because I have 1,000 now. I'm like 1,000 air of subscribers. Pretty dope. But I hope you guys liked this episode. Hit me up on Discord if you need anything, and yeah. Have a good one.